In the spring of 1971, a man named Phil Mercer sat behind his desk at the First National Bank of Anadarko, Oklahoma, and looked across at a 26-year-old in muddy boots who wanted to buy the worst piece of ground in Caddo County. Phil had been trying to get rid of that land for 2 years, 160 acres, 6 miles north of town, sitting empty and cracked and useless since Howard Dawson had given up on it in 1965. The county soil survey had classified it as severely degraded. Phil had listed it at $50 an acre, $8,000 for the whole parcel, and not one farmer in the county had even driven out to look at it a second time. Now here was Curtis Wade, 26 years old, Vietnam veteran, $4,000 to his name after the purchase, wanting to sign the papers. Phil leaned back in his chair. "Curtis," he said, "I knew your grandfather. Elton was the best dirt farmer in this county, but even Elton couldn't have fixed the Dawson place. Howard farmed the life out of that ground for 17 years. The soil's gone. You could plant a dollar bill out there and it wouldn't grow a penny." "I know what the county says," Curtis said. "I want to buy it." Phil processed the paperwork. When Curtis signed the deed, Phil shook his hand and said something Curtis never forgot. "I hope you know what you're getting into. That's the worst 160 acres in Caddo County. Every farmer in this county passed on it. You just bought a problem, not a farm." Curtis folded the deed, put it in his jacket, and walked out into the April morning. He had $4,200 left to his name, 160 acres of dead ground, and something Phil Mercer didn't know about. Now let me tell you about the Dawson place. Because to understand what Curtis saw that nobody else did, you have to understand what had been done to that land. Howard Dawson had farmed those 160 acres from 1948 to 1965. Wheat, every year on every acre, without rotation, without rest. Heavy chemical fertilizer to prop up yields that the soil could no longer produce on its own. By the early 1960s, the ground was already failing, wheat making 12 bushels an acre when the county average was 28. By 1965, Howard was done. He packed up, moved to Oklahoma City, and left the land to sit. For 6 years after that, nobody touched it. No cover crops, no management, nothing. The topsoil, already stripped thin by years of abuse, started washing away in the spring rains. The organic matter, the living biological material that makes soil productive, dropped to almost nothing. When the county came out to survey it, they found 2 inches of topsoil in the good spots and bare subsoil showing through in others. They wrote their report and stamped it, severely degraded. That was the official verdict. That was what every farmer in Caddo County believed when they drove past the Dawson place and kept driving. Curtis Wade drove out on a Saturday morning in April and did something none of those farmers had done. He got out of his truck. He walked to the middle of the field. He knelt down and grabbed a handful of soil the way his grandfather Elton had taught him when Curtis was 7 years old. The soil didn't crumble like cake, the way good ground does. It didn't clump like concrete, the way damaged ground does. It turned to powder and blew out of his hand in the Oklahoma wind before he could close his fingers around it. By everything his grandfather had ever taught him, this soil was dead. But Curtis wasn't looking at the center of the field. He was looking at the edges. Let me tell you about Elton Wade, because this story doesn't begin in 1971. It begins in 1932, when a young man started farming 80 acres of red clay and wheat stubble outside Binger, Oklahoma, and decided to pay attention to something that most farmers never bothered to think about. Elton Wade talked to his dirt, not in a way that would get a man sent to the doctor, in the way a man talks to something he respects. He'd kneel down in his field every morning, grab a handful of soil, smell it, crumble it between his fingers, and tell his grandson things that no textbook had ever printed. "You see how this breaks apart, Curtis? That's life in there. Worms, roots, fungus, all of it working. When soil crumbles like cake, it's healthy. When it clumps like concrete, it's dying. When it turns to powder and blows away, it's already dead. He'd show Curtis the fence lines, the narrow strips of ground along the edges of the fields where the plow had never reached. 3 feet of dark, soft, living earth running alongside the pale, worked-out soil in the middle. You see the difference. Same weather, same rain, same sun, but this ground has never been plowed, never been starved. The roots and the grasses put back what they took. The biology never got interrupted. That's what soil looks like when you don't abuse it. Elton died in 1969 while Curtis was overseas. The 80 acres went to Curtis's uncle, who leased it to a corporate operation and moved to Tulsa. By the time Curtis came home from Vietnam, his grandfather's farm was being run by strangers who didn't know what a handful of crumbling soil meant. Curtis needed his own ground. He needed to do the thing Elton had done. And on that Saturday morning in April of 1971, kneeling in Howard Dawson's dead field with powder blowing out of his hand, Curtis looked at the fence lines and understood something that Phil Mercer and every other farmer in Caddo County had missed. Along every fence line on the Dawson place, where Howard's plow had never reached, there was a strip of ground 3 feet wide that was dark, soft, alive. Wild grasses had been growing on those margins for decades, undisturbed, their roots doing what roots do, breaking up compaction, feeding microbes, building structure. The fence-lined soil crumbled like cake. Curtis grabbed 2 handfuls, one from the dead center, one from the living edge, and held them side by side. Same farm, same history, same weather. One was dust, one was life. The soil in the middle of that field wasn't dead. It was starved. The biology was still there, waiting at the edges, waiting for someone to stop taking and start giving. If you gave it what it needed, roots, cover, rest, time, it would come back. Every farmer who had driven out to the Dawson place had looked at the center of the field and seen ruin. Curtis looked at the fence lines and saw proof of what was possible. He drove back to Anadarko and signed the papers. The first 3 years were the years Curtis nearly lost everything. He didn't plant a cash crop in 1971, not 1 acre. In a county where every farmer planted every field every year because every dollar counted, Curtis Wade planted nothing anyone could sell. Instead, he planted cover crops, crimson clover, hairy vetch, and cereal rye. The same species his grandfather had always kept on the margins of his own fields. He seeded all 160 acres, and then did something that made his neighbors genuinely angry. He left it alone. Didn't plow it under, didn't spray it. Let it grow, die back, decompose, and feed the soil, then planted another round, then another. Word spread through the county the way bad news always spreads in small farming communities. Fast, detailed, and a little cruel. That Wade boy bought the Dawson place and he's growing weeds on purpose, planting clover on dead ground. Might as well plant prayers. Must have left his brain in Vietnam. Phil Mercer heard the talk at the diner, drove out to the Dawson place in October of 1971, saw 160 acres of clover and rye waving in the wind, and shook his head all the way back to town. Curtis heard every word. Some nights he sat on the porch of the old Dawson farmhouse, roof half gone, no running water for the first 2 months, and wondered if they were right. He'd spent everything he had on land that might never produce a crop, eating beans and rice most days, working winters at the grain elevator to keep the lights on. No guarantee that any of this would work. Just a handful of lessons from a man who'd been dead since 1969. But he kept walking his fields. Every week, shovel and notebook. He'd dig a hole in a different spot, study what he found, write it down. Worm count, root depth, soil color, moisture level, the smell of it. In the fall of 1972, the changes were small but real. The soil was darker in patches. The clover had started fixing nitrogen into the ground. When Curtis grabbed a handful from the spots where the cover crops had been thickest, it didn't blow away. It held together barely, but it held. Year 3, more cover crops, more waiting, more neighbors shaking their heads. Curtis was down to almost nothing financially. He took a full-time job at the elevator that winter and spent every spare hour in his fields. Then, in the spring of 1974, 3 years after buying the Dawson place, Curtis planted his first cash crop. 40 acres of winter wheat on the ground that had received the heaviest cover cropping. The other 120 acres stayed in cover. His neighbors' fields were already knee-high when Curtis's was ankle-high. The gossip intensified. Phil Mercer drove past, saw the scraggly wheat, and stopped at the diner to tell everyone the Dawson place was still a graveyard. But Curtis watched that wheat through June and July, watched it thicken, watched the heads fill, watched the stems strengthen in ground that everyone said couldn't grow anything. Harvest came in August. Curtis's 40 acres made 24 bushels an acre. That doesn't sound like much. The county average was 28, but 3 years earlier, that same soil had made 12 bushels under Howard Dawson. Curtis had doubled the yield without a single pound of chemical fertilizer. Just cover crops, patience, and his grandfather's voice in his head telling him what crumbling soil meant. He netted $4,200 from that first harvest, not enough to live on, but enough to know the soil was waking up. Let me tell you about years 4 through 12, because this is where patience stops being a philosophy and starts being power. Curtis followed the same pattern year after year. Each year he moved more acres into cash crops and rotated the rest through cover. He never planted wheat on the same ground 2 years in a row. He added grain sorghum and soybeans to the rotation. He never purchased chemical fertilizer, only what the cover crops put back into the soil naturally, through root decay and the nitrogen fixed by the legumes. The yields climbed every year. Year 5, wheat hit 28 bushels, county average. Year 7, 34 bushels, above average. Year 9, 38 bushels an acre, the highest dryland wheat yield in Caddo County that year. His neighbors, farming with $200 per acre fertilizer budgets, were making 30. People stopped laughing. They started asking questions. What are you putting on that ground? Nothing. Nothing, no nitrogen, no phosphorus. Cover crops, rotation, rest. That can't be right. You can't out-yield us with nothing. I'm not using nothing. I'm using everything that's already in the soil. I just stopped killing it. Phil Mercer stopped by in the spring of 1980. Curtis was 9 years into the Dawson place. Phil looked different than he had in 1971, less confident. The agricultural economy was wobbling. Interest rates were climbing. Some of his farm loans were starting to look shaky. He stood at the edge of Curtis's field for a while without saying anything. The wheat was up and strong and green in a way that didn't match the fertilizer budget behind it. Curtis, he said finally, I owe you an apology for telling you that ground was dead, for telling you you'd bought a problem. Curtis looked up from his planter. You weren't the only one who thought that. How did you know? How did you know it would come back? Curtis was quiet for a moment. He reached down and grabbed a handful of soil from the field edge. Let it crumble between his fingers. Dark, rich, falling apart the way good soil falls apart. My grandfather taught me, he said. He said soil isn't a thing you use up. It's a thing you take care of. It's alive. And anything that's alive can heal if you give it what it needs. Phil looked at the soil in Curtis's hand. Then he looked at the field. Your grandfather was a smart man, he said. He was, Curtis said. Then 1983 arrived, and that's when the scientists came. The Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service had been running a statewide soil health survey, pulling random samples from farms across the state as part of a new research initiative. Curtis's 160 acres came up in the sample. The inspector who drove out was a young agronomist named Dr. Sarah Chen from Oklahoma State University. She took samples from 12 locations across Curtis's fields and 3 neighboring farms for comparison. Standard procedure. She expected to spend a morning, write up her numbers, and move on. She spent 2 days. When the lab results came back, she drove out to the Dawson place personally and spread the reports across the tailgate of her truck. Curtis's soil showed 4.8% organic matter. The county average was 1.6. His water infiltration rate, how fast rainfall soaked into the ground instead of running off, was 3 times the county norm. His microbial activity levels were the highest she had recorded in the state. His topsoil, which had measured 2 inches when he bought the property in 1971, now measured nearly 6. She looked up from the papers. "Mr. Wade, in 12 years, you've built 4 inches of topsoil. Do you understand what that means? The natural rate of topsoil formation is roughly 1 inch per century. You've done 400 years of soil building in 12. Curtis looked at the numbers for a moment. Then he looked at his field. "I just did what my grandfather taught me," he said. Dr. Chen spent her second day documenting everything: his rotation schedule, his cover crop mixes, his complete refusal to use synthetic inputs in 12 years of farming. She published a paper the following year. Other researchers came, then farmers, then journalists. The Dawson place, the worst 160 acres in Caddo County, the land every farmer had passed on, the ground the banker had called dead, became a demonstration site for soil regeneration that drew visitors from 3 states. Curtis hosted them every spring for 15 years, showed them the fence lines, showed them the soil samples, told them about Elton Wade and the handful of crumbling earth and what it meant when soil fell apart like cake. He never charged a penny. Phil Mercer retired from the bank in 1992. At his retirement dinner, someone asked him what the best loan he'd ever made was. Phil thought about it for a moment. "That's easy," he said. "The worst loan I ever made was the best one. I sold Curtis Wade 160 acres of dead ground for $8,000 because I thought the land was worthless and I just wanted it off my books." He paused. "Turns out the land wasn't dead. We were just too ignorant to see what it needed. Curtis saw it. And that $8,000 piece of dirt is now worth more per acre than any ground in the county." By 2002, the Dawson place was appraised at $1,400 an acre. Curtis had paid $50 an acre in 1971, a 28 times return on land that every farmer in Caddo County had driven past without stopping. He still lives on the Dawson place. He stopped farming it himself in 2014 and leased it to a young couple from the county. He had one condition: you don't kill the soil, you feed it. That's the only rule. He still walks the fields with a shovel sometimes, still grabs a handful from the dark earth and crumbles it between his fingers, still smells it the way Elton Wade taught him when Curtis was 7 years old and the world was simpler, and a man could learn everything he needed to know about farming from a handful of dirt and a grandfather patient enough to explain it. The soil crumbles like cake now, every inch of it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that institutions cannot certify and banks cannot appraise. It lives in the hands of men who were taught by men who were taught by men, passed down in the specific way knowledge passes when it has no other vessel, through demonstration, through repetition, through the patience of someone crouching in a field and saying, "Here, feel this, remember what this means." Phil Mercer had degrees. He had 30 years of agricultural lending behind him. He had county soil surveys and extension service reports and every official measurement of what that land was worth. Curtis Wade had a dead man's voice in his head and a way of grabbing soil that he'd learned before he was old enough to drive a tractor. One of those things can be written in a report. One of them cannot. The Dawson place had been abused for 17 years and abandoned for 6, By every measurable standard, it was finished. The county said so. The bank said so. Every farmer who drove past said so. But the fence lines told a different story. The fence lines showed what the soil remembered, what it could still do if someone stopped taking from it and started giving back. Curtis Wade listened to the fence lines instead of the farmers. He listened to his grandfather instead of the banker. He planted cover crops on dead ground and walked his fields every week for 12 years with a shovel and a notebook, and the unglamorous, unrecognized patience of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed. The soil inspector looked at the test results and said this can't be right. But it was right. It had always been right. It just needed someone willing to wait long enough to prove it. Some ground isn't dead. It's just waiting for the right hands. And some knowledge doesn't live in reports or surveys or official classifications. It lives in the memory of soil that was treated well, and in the hands of the men who learned from their fathers, from their grandfathers, from crouching in a field at 7 years old and being told what crumbling earth means, how to treat it that way again. Curtis Wade brought 160 acres back from nothing with clover and patience, and a handful of lessons from a man who had been dead since 1969. The banker called it dead ground. 12 years later, the scientists called it the healthiest soil in the state. The only difference between those two verdicts was time, and the one man stubborn enough to give it what it needed.